What would happen to the country if overnight it expelled all teachers from its territory for good? That's almost what Portugal did in 1759 with the decree of the Marquis of Pombal. The Society of Jesus, which managed everything from basic to higher education in the kingdom, was banned, and along with it, schools, universities, and the very educational model that supported the empire. But after all, what was Jesuit education like? How did they arrive and develop in the Portuguese Empire? How many colleges, schools, and universities did they have? And how did they impact education in Portugal? Why did expelling this order ruin education only in Portugal, but not in other countries where it was also expelled? In today's video, we'll discuss the Jesuits' expulsion, its devastating impact on Portuguese education, and lasting effects into the 20th century. Before we start, if you enjoy our content, join our channel now. This gives you access to our group, exclusive content, and live classes, plus a deeper look behind the scenes of history. The Jesuit order's relationship with the Kingdom of Portugal was intense from the start, even before papal approval. According to an article by Antonio Lopes about Jesuit education in Portugal, in 1539 a year, before the order was recognized by the Pope, the King of Portugal, Dom João III, had already expressed a desire for some religious order to send missionaries to Christianize the territories conquered by Portugal, whether in Africa, the East, or Brazil. And Dom João used his ambassador in Rome not only to facilitate the recognition of the Jesuit order by the Pope, but also to recruit the order to act urgently in Portugal. And, beyond the missionary spirit, Dom João III was also very concerned with education in the kingdom. The king not only permanently established the university in Coimbra, but also began to fund Portuguese students with scholarships at the Sorbonne, at the University of Paris, to transform higher education in Portugal. In fact, among the scholarship recipients was Simão Rodrigues, co-founder of the Society of Jesus alongside Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The King of Portugal saw the kingdom expanding more and more, both militarily and territorially, with ever greater conquest overseas. He also wanted this reflected in the kingdom's education, which still lagged behind the rest of Europe. And with Dom João III, Portugal was the first country in Europe to recognize and support Jesuit expeditions to all corners of the empire. Saint Francisco Xavier was sent to Asia, where he did remarkable work in Christianizing China, India, and Japan. In Brazil, figures such as Father José de Anchieta, also a Jesuit, stand out. In 1555, at just 20 years old, he developed a work called The Art of Grammar of the Most Spoken Language on the coast of Brazil in an attempt to synthesize the Jesuits' learning of the Tupi language. Thus, at the age of 20, Anchieta developed an unprecedented indigenous grammar to teach missionaries how to speak the native languages. And Anchieta also played a central role in defending Brazilian territory against foreign invasions, especially during the French Antarctic expedition. King Dom João III was so committed to spreading the Jesuit order overseas that he also reformed Portugal's main order. The Order of Christ, which was previously a crusading order that financed mercantilist expeditions, redirected all its resources to fund the Jesuit missionaries. With the Order of Christ's sponsorship and wealth, the Jesuits reached the planet's most distant corners. And to understand why the Jesuits dominated Portuguese education, we first need to understand the very nature of the order. Founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the Society of Jesus combined a military and apologetic character, especially characterized by the development of evangelization and study techniques. The initial purpose of the order was to convert Protestant populations in Europe to Catholicism. This even happened in royal houses, with the Jesuits managing to convert Queen Christina of Sweden. This even led her to abdicate the Swedish throne and crown because of her conversion to Catholicism. Jesuits like Bento de Guay, who was Portuguese, crossed the Himalayan mountains to search for lost Christian communities in Central Asia, and the Jesuits were closely linked to many counter-Reformation policies, and the order in the Portuguese Empire proliferated greatly in its educational centers through its colleges. The Jesuits created the Ratio Studiorum, a method that standardized the curriculum and promoted advanced study in the humanities, theology, rhetoric, logic, and languages. In fact, it was common to organize oral exams and public debates to encourage students to develop logical reasoning. And together with the natives of the missions, they also taught practical knowledge such as agriculture. In Portugal, the Jesuits had 26 colleges, 2 schools, and 1 university. The University of Évora, which was a Jesuit college before being elevated to the status of a university. In Brazil, there were 11 colleges, 5 schools, and 10 seminaries, while Japan had 10 Jesuit colleges, nearly matching Brazil's number. And that was also similar to those in India and China. And many of these colleges stood out for offering higher education courses. In fact, the Chamber of Salvador, then the capital of Brazil, made a petition to the Portuguese crown, so the Jesuit College of Salvador could be elevated to university status like the College of Évora a few years earlier. That's because Salvador offered 4 higher education courses, including doctorates. Key Portuguese historical figures like Father Gregorio de Matos and Father Antonio Vieira graduated in theology and philosophy from the Jesuit College of Salvador. Another notable Jesuit college was in São Paulo de Macau, China, offering courses in mathematics, astronomy, theology, philosophy, Chinese, Latin, and Portuguese. From there, the main missionaries went on to preach in Asia and Southeast Asia. The Jesuits completely monopolized secondary education. The Santo Antão College in Lisbon, for example, offered free education to everyone who could read, and it was a reference in technical and scientific education. It had the famous Aula da Esfera, which taught students advanced concepts in mathematics, geography, geometry, and astronomy. In fact, great Jesuit astronomers, like the German Christophorus Clavius, studied in Portugal under the influence of other Jesuits, such as Pedro da Fonseca, who was known as the Portuguese Aristotle. And many craters on the moon still bear the names of Jesuit observers and astronomers, the great Luis de Molina and Francisco Suarez, Jesuits involved in major debates about the right of resistance to absolutism, tyrannicide, and the right of conquest, taught in Coimbra. And the greatest philosophical debates took place in the corridors of Spanish and Portuguese universities. But in the 18th century, overnight, the entire order was expelled from the kingdom. One of history's least understood movements was when the Marquis of Pombal used the Tavora incident, where a noble family was accused of attacking King Dom José to his advantage, to justify the expulsion of the order from Portugal, and the consequence was immediate. The education system collapsed. Portugal not only expelled a religious order, but also expelled almost all the teachers in the kingdom. In mainland Portuguese territory alone, there were about 20,000 students who studied in the halls of the schools run by the order, and these were immediately shut down by the will of the Marquis. To replace the Jesuit system, Pombal created the College of Nobles, an elitist and poorly structured school. The old Santanto College had 2,500 students, but the new one began with under 100, offering only literary subjects, not scientific ones. Founded in 1761, the College of Nobles took years to open and began with just 24 students. Without enough teachers or complete subjects in higher education, the entire University of Évora was closed, and in Coimbra, due to the lack of college preparation, the number of students dropped from 3,000 to just 500. That's because the students from the few remaining colleges could no longer reach the status of the academy. This impacts the kingdom so much that Portugal won't regain its pre-Jesuit expulsion number of academics until the 20th century. According to the historian Nuno Palma, before the expulsion, literacy rates in Portugal were comparable to those in Northern Europe. But as time went by, the country plunged into illiteracy. The emblematic sphere class, where logarithms were taught, Mercator projection explained, and telescopes operated, was closed, symbolizing the intellectual blackout that followed. A key example occurred at the University of Evora, where a room with tiles depicting the demonstration of the vacuum and other tiles representing magnetism, where students learned the concepts of physics and astronomy. It started being used, after Pombal's decree, as a stable to house horses, and this also reflects the imprisonment of scientists. Professor Nuno Palma mentions Pombal and gives the example of Bento de Moura, Portugal, a Portuguese scientist and member of the Royal Society of London, who improved the steam engine. Being a Knight of the Order of Christ and disagreeing with the expulsion of the Jesuits and the persecution against the Tavora family, he was persecuted and imprisoned by Pombal for strictly political reasons and died in prison. Pombal aimed to create an educational system focused not on faith or intellectual development, but on producing individuals useful to the Portuguese state. And, to fill the void, he created the so-called royal classes, with separate subjects of Latin, Greek, and rhetoric, each taught by a different teacher, without a defined curriculum and no continuity between them. Teachers were underpaid and unprepared, often appointed by recommendation, and improvised to fill the gap left by the Jesuits. Many of these teachers had only a superficial understanding of the subject they taught. In the 1820s and 1830s, the University of Coimbra, the only one in the country, operated with great irregularity, with entire years when it remained closed, and it was shut down in 1829. The few primary schools in the country were cut in half to save money, and these effects reached Brazil and Portugal all the way into the 20th century. The much publicized illiteracy rates during Salazar's era can be explained by the dismantling of formative education. After Pombal expelled the Jesuits, Pedro IV later expelled the religious orders. And to cover up the disaster, Pombal introduced the chronological deduction, imposing a book on all the offices of the empire. In that book, he blamed the Jesuits for all of Portugal's problems, from ignorance to economic backwardness. It was a very forced narrative, but it was extremely effective, as the historian Charles Boxer reports. Pombal's arguments in the work were extremely generic, and the documents he used to try to support his claims did not corroborate at all with what was being alleged. However, he was highly efficient in propaganda. If Portugal had terrible illiteracy rates, the issue wasn't expelling most teachers from the empire, but Jesuit foolishness. They only taught catechism and tried to stop children from learning to read. If Portugal had few universities, it wasn't the crown's fault, but the fault of the foolish Jesuits, who even had a university themselves and opposed rational education of the enlightened Marquis and King. And what's interesting is that in the Expulsion decree, it is stated that in the name of the king, the memory of the Jesuit schools should be abolished, as if they had never existed in my kingdoms or domains. Pombal is dedicated not only to destroying education, but also to defaming the only people in the kingdom actually contributing to it. Interested in increasing absolutist power, other European courts follow Portugal in expelling the Jesuits and pressure the papacy to dissolve the order. But although other European courts followed Portugal's example, in none of them was the impact so devastating. In Spanish America, there were other orders and other universities, but Portugal depended almost exclusively on the Society of Jesus after the expulsion of the Jesuits by Charles III. In Spain, for example, they were painfully replaced in the California missions by the Franciscans, as well as in the universities, with the Franciscans and Dominicans taking their place. In Portuguese America, the Jesuits were so influential and prominent in the Portuguese state that no other order could replace them. And what's interesting to note in this whole process is that the absolutist states made efforts to extinguish the Jesuit order, thinking that this way they would consolidate absolutism. The result appeared decades later with the French Revolution and the complete reordering of Europe's political system through revolution. In trying to destroy the Society of Jesus, Pombal ended up ruining Portuguese education. And the same kings who dreamed of eliminating intellectual resistance to absolutism ended up paving the way for something much worse: the bloody revolutions that followed all over the world. Since you already knew about the Jesuits' role in the Portuguese Empire, what surprised you most? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and get to know the fascinating Iberian history even more.